Hello, Grand Prix educators and scientists, and welcome to Webinar 5 of Vacuum Forming. Thank you for tuning in last week on our Tuning 101, I believe, Cam?
That's right.
That's right. Hey, how are we doing today, by the way?
We're doing so good. How about yourself?
Doing wonderful.
That's what I like to hear.
This time, we are doing a pseudo-live stream with some scheduling difficulties in space. You know, transmissions get a little funky here and there. So we're just going to get to you with pseudo-live comments after the fact. But do you know the rules? If you have any questions, type them in and we'll be sure to answer them for you. So I say we beam down the boys, Daniel and Steven.
I agree.
All right, let's do it. Come on in, boys.
Hey, Cam, Andrew, great to see you.
That one's Daniel.
Hey guys, what's up? Steven here. Good to see you again.
Boys, do you want to talk about a little bit about vacuum forming and introducing today's episode?
Yes, so like Andrew said last week, we talked about tuning. It was a Tuning 101 basics of getting your car race ready for our endurance race. So today we're going to focus a little bit on how to create a mold and how to vacuum form, the whole process of vacuum forming. So you might be having a question, what is vacuum forming exactly? It's a very good question. Cam, can you help us with that?
I can.
Okay, so we're going to beam me down.
Down where?
Down to earth. We got a secret workshop there. Don't worry about it. Top secret. Can't talk about it. Cam, let me know when you're ready. 3, 2, 1. Ooh. Whoa. What's up, guys? Steven here with HQ. Looks like we're in an earthbound workshop doing some vacuum forming. Let's see what we got going on here. Ooh, looks like we got beautiful sag going with our plastic. Let's lift our vacuuming table up. And we're gonna suck the air out. Perfect, look at that. What is vacuum forming? That is vacuum forming. Guys, take me back up. All right, so some jacket always comes off for some reason. Let's put it back on. Okay, so now that you have a little bit of idea what vacuum forming is, we're basically heating up plastic, stretching it over a mold, taking all the air out, and coming up with a copy.
So in a car, it's probably important to protect the components of the vehicle. So essentially, we don't want to have all your stuff exposed.
Yeah.
So we're building a body, right?
Exactly. So the main purpose of having the body is to keep all the guts or the electricals from spilling out. Also, if and when you crash the car, you're not going to get things that are going to be smashed around too much, or it keeps the car safe, it keeps the electrics safe, keeps your fuel cell safe, and it gets us ready to go. So the first thing that I like to talk about when discussing vacuum forming is creating a mold. Right?
Mold, plug?
Mold, plug, your form. There's a lot of different terms for it, but basically the idea of what we're doing here is we have some kind of a mold that we use. We heat up a piece of plastic, as you guys saw in the video. That plastic gets formed over our mold. We pull the mold apart. Perfect copies. This one's pretty good. So I think let's talk about a couple of ways of making a mold. There's many ways to do it. There's some pretty high-tech ways that we're going to discuss. There's also a couple of low-tech ways. It really just depends on the amount of resources you have at your disposal.
So,
yeah.
Let's go through the different kinds of way of making a mold.
Yeah, the first way that I started experimenting with this when I first started doing this was 3D printing. I have a background with some CAD software, so for me that was a pretty easy way to do it. And this is basically the mold that I made from that. You can see right here, and in case you guys are wondering, I use PLA for this. Through my experience, I probably would use something a little bit better for heat. Maybe ABS or some kind of polycarbonate I think would work a lot better. But I did use PLA for the first time, and I did it with 100% infill. It takes a long time to actually print it, but it worked pretty decently.
What if you have a small 3D printer and you can't print the whole car?
If your 3D printer can't print the whole car, which most of them can't, if you notice on this one, and especially here, I actually took the model, the CAD file that I had, I cut it up into 6 pieces, as you can kind of see, one in that way. So that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I printed it up in 6 individual pieces. And my printer was pretty small, and it was able to print all of them. So I think if you have a small printer, that's the way to go. And you can even cut these. If you have a really small printer, you can cut each of these pieces in half, go with 12 pieces, and glue them all together with some kind of acrylic glue. It's a pretty easy way to do it.
What's this over here made out of?
This right here, so like I said, ideally, if you want a whole lot of detail, 3D printing is the way to go, because as you can see, you get a whole lot of detail here. It's really good. But the problem with 3D printing, and especially certain materials, is you might be able to see, if we can get the overhead cam here, there's a little bit of deformation. You're constantly heating this up and cooling it down, and so if we can exaggerate it, the material is it's constantly moving and flexing. So that'll cause it to deteriorate over time. If you're like us and you got a couple hundred molds to make, the best way to do it is to get either a block of wood or foam or some kind of material CNC'd, right? And this was formed from 2 different pieces, and you can tell that even this one right here, a little bit of moving from constantly heating it, and a little bit of deformation there. But this is the mold we've been using this year, and this one is a workhorse. This one's rock solid, it works great. And basically what's going on with the CNC, think of it like a big drill, kind of like a 3D printer, and it just basically cuts out, and it cuts out. You find the mold inside of a big block.
So now what if we don't have access to these fancy machines?
If you don't have access to the fancy machines, there's a couple of really good low-tech ways to do it. I call them low-tech because you're not using any kind of sophisticated equipment. You're using basic hand tools, and the easiest way to start is either with clay or a block of foam. Right? And then you want to make sure that you adhere to certain size specifications, whatever you're doing. We actually have size specifications. Cam, can we pull that up? So if you guys haven't already done so, go in the Google Drive, check out the rules. It gives you the dimensions that you need to build the actual mold, which if we're considering this one here, we got that up, Cam?
Yeah.
Perfect. So that tells you it's in millimeters, so it's universal, European, US, whatever. But this one right here is roughly about 18 inches long this way, about 6.5 inches wide this way, and about 6 inches tall this way. So that's roughly the dimensions you need. You can obviously shrink it just a little bit. Don't go too much bigger because we do have a size restriction, but this is roughly about the size you want to make it.
Okay.
So,
and what are these white ones here?
So if you do, again, we talked about many ways of doing this. We definitely don't want you guys out there to buy store-bought shells. Store-bought shells look kind of like this, right? The detail's really great. They look nice, but you didn't make it yourself. There wasn't a whole lot of engineering going into it. I mean, anyone can just go and buy one. So, but if you take a little bit of that mindset with a little bit of creative mindset, you can take something like this, some kind of a mold, fill it with plaster, as we did here with these miniature ones, and you can splash your own, we'll call it a positive, and then from there you can vacuum form, make your own negatives off of it.
Okay.
So what we're going to do, Dan, the challenge for you is we're going to have you make a mold, and we're going to vacuum form it at the end of this video. So you're going to start with a block of foam here, and at the end of it we're going to do a foam one, we're going to do a 3D printed one, and we are going to do a plaster one. And in case you guys are curious, what type of plaster did I use? Plaster of Paris. Not a plug for them. You can use any kind of brand, I guess, but this is the easiest stuff to find. It's really cheap, and it works really well.
Okay.
So,
all right, I'll see you back in a bit.
Dan, have at it.
Thank you.
Okay, so while Dan's working on that, I'm going to take a little bit of time and explain to you what a vacuum forming table is. I'm going to go over some essential parts of it just so you have a better idea of what you're doing. So there's 4 main components for a vacuum form. There's a couple other components, but I'm going to keep it simple here. First of all, you need some kind of a heating source. Could we get overhead cam here? So we got our heating source here. You're going to need some type of a frame, a way to hold your plastic. As you can see with this frame here, plastic is just kind of sandwiched in between 2 pieces of metal. You don't have to do it this way. This is just a way to do it. You're going to need your vacuum box as a way to suck all the air out. And then last but not least, you're going to need your plastic. So those are the basic elements of what a vacuum form is. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Great, that's awesome. I don't have access to any of this equipment. How can I do this if I want to do this as a project with some students or just as a project of my own? Very good question. I actually spent some time last season, and I built a vacuum forming box. As we can see here, this one's pretty low tech. It's not as sophisticated as the secret warehouse that we were at. It's not as sophisticated as this one underneath here, but it has all the basic components and it gets the job done. So let's talk about our components again. For this one, I'll just start off by saying I use the oven. The best thing you could use is an electric oven, so there's not that much of a risk of anything catching fire. But if you're going to use an oven, make sure you designate your oven just for vacuum forming. Again, because if you're going to cook food or something out of it, I probably wouldn't cook out of something that you use for plastic forming, but that's up to you. So with our heating element aside, you need your frame. Again, this was super basic. I just got a piece. And the reason I made it this size specifically was because this is what fit in my oven. And as you can see here, if we can get a little bit of detail, I just basically got a piece of plastic, I stapled it to it, and then I stuck it in the oven for a set amount of time. Exactly how long, that's kind of complicated. That'll be part of another video series that we're going to do, getting really into the nitty-gritty of this. But we have, so two elements, your heating element, which was the oven, our frame, and then our vacuum table. This is probably the funnest part you're going to have with building this process. So basically what I did is I got some 4x4s here, or some 2x4s actually. I made them into a pretty simple square frame. From there I put a piece of plywood on the bottom and a piece of pegboard on top, right? Now on the bottom, I made a couple of different holes. And I'll explain the reasoning why. I first started off with this hole, and I used a shop vac. The shop vac seemed to work okay, but it didn't provide enough suction. So from there, I went down to this hole here. If we can get a picture of that one. And I used a second shop vac. Now that one worked a little bit better, but it still didn't have the amount of vacuum that I did. So I called a buddy of mine who owns a brake shop, and I borrowed a vacuum pump from him. And you can see this small hole here, right there in the bottom corner. That's where I attached the vacuum pump. Honestly, you can probably get away with just the vacuum pump, or at the very least, maybe a shop vac and a vacuum pump. But the vacuum pump made the difference for me. So basically, if I can go over this here, talk about what I did. I stapled a sheet of plastic, right? What type of plastic? Very good question. I use PETG. There's a lot of different thicknesses you can use. Anywhere from 0.020 to 0.040 is probably pretty good for this process. You can also use different types of polycarbonates. There's the black body that I showed you guys earlier. You can use Lexan. There's a lot of different types of plastics. So basically what you do is you take your frame, you staple. This isn't cut to size. This is just to kind of show you guys the idea. You would staple this to here. And from there, you would stick this in the oven. Once you get the right amount of sag, you would take it out. I made a little stop here. So boom, boom, straight down over your mold. And then from here, the vacuums and the vacuum pump should already be on. So as soon as you hit this, you're nice and you get your vacuum pretty good. It'll make pretty decent copies of what you're doing. And again, this is a pretty low-tech way, but it's very effective. All the car bodies I made for last year's race were made on this exact table here. So low-tech, simple, but effective, right? So with that in mind, so we talked about low-tech ways of making our mold here. Let's go into a little bit more of a high-tech way. Andrew, can you help me with the computer there real quick? So again, I have a background in engineering, and I love any kind of CAD design. That's one of my favorite things to do. So again, I had a good time with actually designing this. Let's face it so we could get it, see with the camera here. I am basically just using Fusion 360. It's one of my favorite things to use for now. We have a couple of videos that go over tutorial of how to create a mold. This is just the Mirai body here. This is a CAD file of it. And you can just kind of see this one's hollow. You can make it filled. There's a lot of things you can do with this software in particular. So this is the way I did it. And then from here you can actually cut it up. You can make it smaller. I have it already cut up, but if you wanted to cut it up to fit your printer specifically, that's fine. And then again, just to kind of go back into it, I use PLA. I found that from my experience, PLA was maybe not the best solution for this. I would use some kind of a polycarbonate or like acrylic. I think that'll hold up to the heat a lot better. That's up to you guys to experiment with. Let us know what you do. Let us know what you come up with. If you come up with a better way, I'm all ears. I'd love to hear it. So let's maybe go back to Dan and see how he's doing.
Well,
Dan,
how we doing?
how's the process going here, buddy?
You know, I think I'm pretty much done. I give it the good old Horizon try.
That's pretty close.
I would say so as well.
And again, let's just understand that we're doing this to scale.
So, again, I'm happy to walk through the process of my methodology.
Let's talk about it. I'd like to know what you did here.
What do you do? So, basically, how do you get from a block to a car? Well, the first thing I thought about was, hey, let's measure it off on a square. So, you need to know exactly how long it is, length and width, but then you also have to know height. So basically, on one side you take height, like this, we good to go? So we got height on one side, so I measured it off here, and then on the other side, I did length and width, measured off there.
So what you're saying is, you started off with a rough block.
I did.
Okay.
And I try to make it a little bit bigger, because as you go off, you're going to try to get down to size, but, the less work you have when sculpting, the better, I don't know.
That makes sense.
But the larger you make it, the more room you have for error. So I think that's one good thing to think about. Don't try to make it small as possible. Try to probably make it.
Yeah, give yourself some wiggle room.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm all about that.
So then
That's
you
cool.
look at the mold that we had, which was the Mini Mirai comparative. You see, it did pretty good when it came to basically overall length, and then height. Pretty good as well.
Yeah, and then just for a scale, or just for a little bit of reference, this here is 10th scale, which means if you take the actual size of the car, divide its dimensions by 10, you get this size. And if this one's 30 scale, 1/30th scale, roughly. So again, you take the dimensions of a car, divide it by 30, this is about the size you get. So we are keeping somewhat with the theme here. We're trying to keep it spatial, accurate as much as we can. But let's try these now. So bring them over. Let's do one of each. Let's do one of plaster, one of the PLA, and one of the foam, and we'll see what kind of results we get here. Any way you wish, doesn't really matter. Let's put them more or less towards the middle here. Okay, so as we talked about, the first part is the heating element. Yes, and then let's give this a minute to heat. Andrew, yeah, you want to give us a little help there with some juice? It really helps if things are plugged in, and they tend to work better that way. So, we good? Okay, we got a little light letting me know that our heat is on. So
And as you see over here, the coils spread out. Even heat, I'm sure, is key to success for getting the droop you want, or the...
I call it sag. Some people call it sag. Some people call it droop.
Sag, droop. We're in Hollywood, so we'll call it sag.
Sure, that works. And if we can get the overhead cam going here, you can see that these coils here are starting to turn red. Once they all get red pretty evenly, that's when I start it. I mean, you could just leave it over and let it heat up like that slowly, but I found that the results are better. You let it get nice and hot first, then you do it. So from here, Dan, I know you don't have a whole lot of experience with this, but I'm going to let you do this one on your own.
Okay.
Give you a little bit of help. So once these coils are nice and red, can we see it on camera? We got the nice red coils there.
Maybe it's hard to tell. I guarantee you it's very warm.
It's warm.
So
it's definitely warm.
There, it's got heated, distributed evenly all over. So this is going to start heating automatically, and then so I assume I'm just going to start watching for a little bit of a...
Yeah, so if we can get the ship cam over here, you're going to see a couple of things happen. So first of all, you're going to notice that we see the heating there. It's still pretty rough, right? It's still pretty hard, okay? We'll give this a few minutes. And one thing I want you to notice, if we can get the camera on top here, so the first thing that's going to happen with the plastic is it's going to start to scrunch up, right? The molecules within the plastic are being affected by the heat. So the first thing that's going to happen here is it's going to scrunch up because it's trying to figure out, hey, what's going on here? And then after, it's going to relax. And once it starts to relax, you'll notice that, so you can feel it now, Dan, it's starting to get soft, right?
Nice.
So we're almost there.
Nice.
Nice, yeah. So I kind of do a little bit of a testing here. I'm not leaving my hand on it, if you guys notice, because your hand will get burned and it doesn't feel very good. So what we're looking for, the idea here is once this plastic, and we're using PETG, again, in case you guys are wondering, same stuff that they use to make soda bottles or water bottles. But once the PETG sags just to about below this line here, if we can get the ship cam again, we're just going to get it right to about that line. Once we get about that much sag, it should work. So it takes a little bit. This material we're using here is a .040 thickness, so it's a little bit thicker. And again, when you guys are designing this, that's something to consider as, you know, if you want a little bit thicker, it's kind of like we talked about last one, is durability over weight.
And I assume you're going to have to do a few runs before you figure out what sweet spot is.
Yes, I will say that vacuum forming is a process. Hold on, let's give it a little bit more. Give it a little bit more. I think you're probably good there. Okay, so something to consider here. I call vacuum forming a process. It's very much an art. It's not the easiest thing to do. And you guys are going to notice when you're doing this for yourselves, it's not going to come out perfect. It's going to be very hard. You're going to need a couple runs before you can get them nice and even and straight, like this one here. Get the overhead cam. This one you can see there's no seams in it. If you look at these ones here, this is called webbing. When I first started doing this, maybe the first 20 copies that I made all had webbing of some sort. So it is a process. You're going to have to figure it out a bit. When you guys do this for yourselves, buy some extra material. They sell them in 4x8 foot sheets. Buy 1 or 2 of those sheets and cut it up and use it as you need it. Again, because you're going to need a few practice tries. So it is a process. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but it is doable. So from here, now that our plastic, so you notice our plastic is actually nice and hard again. So we'll pop these molds out. Nice and easy here. Maybe not. And they're in there.
All right.
That one's
Just
out.
really strong. Kind of seems stuck. This one just come on out.
That one will come on out. Got a little bit of melting here, but that's fine. Just push it pretty. There you go. So now from here, let's pop our actual piece of plastic off of the frame. And as you can see, the one that you made was actually pretty close to the scale. I mean, we can see it pretty close if we look at these cars right next to each other, but then the molds they're pretty close as far as dimensions. Yeah, that's actually a pretty good job.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, it kind of looked like you know what you're doing.
Yeah, I hear that a lot around here.
So I think that's pretty much a good idea of, it's a good outline or overview of what vacuum forming is. Again, this is going to be this is a smaller part of, it's going to be a 3-part series where we're going to go into mold making, vacuum forming making, and all that kind of stuff. But from here, I think that's a good stopping point. We have a good idea of how to make a mold, of how to create a box, at least in theory. So
I think today just showed that you could do this at home. You don't need all these fancy things to make something. It's DIY projects.
Exactly. It is very much a DIY project, as you can see from my homemade vacuum forming thing here. Just a couple of pieces of 2x4, some plywood, and a little bit of ingenuity, and you can get a lot done with this. So it's very doable.
All right.
I think
Let's call it a day.
let's call it a day. Yeah, let's get some food.
Okay.
Thank you guys for watching.
And we'll see you next week.
We'll see you next week for our next installment. Dan, what are we talking about next week?
I don't know. Let's leave it up in the air.
I like that. A
Okay.
little bit of mystery for you. All right, guys. Thanks a lot. We'll see you next week. Peace from Horizon.
Yeah, okay, let me start. 1, I know